A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're back with Christian commentator Stephen McAlpine and casting an eye to some developments in Europe. Now, you've heard us talking about a quiet revival in places like the UK and America and even here in Australia. Now there is evidence a quiet revival is happening in European nations, including France. Now that might be significant because France has been known as one of the most stubbornly, proudly secular countries in the West. And now, all of a sudden, it appears to be full of evangelical churches. Well, there's research now that's backing this up. It's shedding light on the phenomenon of a quiet revival in France, and Stephen McAlpine's been monitoring the action of what's going on. He's an award-winning Christian author, pastor and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. Stephen McAlpine, always good to talk. Welcome back to 2020. Have we got you, Stephen?
Yeah. Do you?
Yes, I've got you. Yes. Okay.
I said bonjour, just to keep the French stuff.
Well, bonjour to you too. Hey, it turns out, something's happening in France, and you might even assume that places like France, and there's a number of European countries that boast of their secularity or their atheism. Hey, what do you think's going on there?
Well, that's interesting. There was a video, a YouTube production by a news company in France, which was entitled "Why France is Suddenly Full of Evangelical Churches." Now, that might be off a low base, so let's go there for a start. But it seems to have that Le Quiet Revival has picked up in France. And it's interesting that the last 4 years there's been an increase in Roman Catholic baptisms in France, but no corresponding tracking with evangelicals. But suddenly there seems to be a little growth spurt of evangelicals. And a lot of that is coming off the back of, I think, the upheaval of the last 5 or 6 years. And I wrote a piece about it in which I parked the fire at Notre Dame as kind of a hinge moment in the French experience, which could have gone one of two ways. And I think the fire at Notre Dame, and we can dig into this a little bit, came at a time and a place in the world which raised some serious questions about the nature of meaning and purpose and where we're going.
The fire at Notre Dame, which is what we have been in Australia familiar with because it literally is a global phenomenon when that fire happened. Notre Dame Cathedral, so famous. At the same time as that fire in Notre Dame, there were dozens of churches that were also burned at the time. Now, that's a different story, the one that wasn't really reported, internationally, because Notre Dame Cathedral had all the details. But that fieriness, that was a sort of thing that illustrative of the faith of the French people and the idea that let's get churches out of here. Do you think that might be a turning point?
Well, it's interesting that Notre Dame was filled with tourists, not worshippers most weeks. And but when it burned, and there was a great photo of the spire itself with the cross sort of crashing down into the middle of the church in a fire. And J.M. Coetzee, the novelist, said, "The fire of April 15 confronts us with this intolerable fait accompli." At least he used the French for it. There is no eternity. And that's a big statement, isn't it? It was like saying that this fire is symbolic of secularism's triumph over any view of the world outside of the visible. And that was in April 2019. Now, we know what happened at the end of 2019 into 2022, COVID. And that raised a lot of difficult questions. And in France, which was held a view of its religious framework as historically it was there, but it was no longer meaningful, questions started to be raised again. And so France has come from a very positive secular framework when it was, and it especially did so when it was a monoculture, to a very uncertain secular framework, I think, at the moment. It's overwhelmingly secular, no doubt, but there are lots of ruptures in the society, both in terms of the religious movements and the failure of secularism to advance, meaning and purpose in people's lives. And the fire seemed to be a tipping point, and people used it as a sense of saying, well, religion's over, there's the fire that did it in, and God sort of has gone, hang on a minute, that's not how it goes.
When you talk about meaning and purpose, let's come back to this because there might be some alignments with the way we think about what's going on in Australia and the idea of quiet revival here. But coming back to the evangelical churches in particular, and that's where this particular item that you're reflecting on, a little bit of research there. Back in 1950, there were as few as 50,000 evangelicals in France. And I'm staggered to read now that there's somewhere an estimated 745,000 active participating evangelical Christians. And the thought here, I'll get your thoughts. I mean, these are the sorts of things that you can see that are happening as a tangible evidence. Something like a new church opening every 10 days in France.
Well, this is interesting that the secular narrative has been that progressive secularism will eventually get Christianity on the ropes like a punch-drunken boxer and land one last punch to the jaw. And France has been a graveyard for evangelicalism, but as we know, what Jesus does in graveyards, right? But what's interesting is that at the same time that there's a rise in Islam in France through migration, there's a rise in Christianity in France through migration as well. France is a much less monocultural place. And we saw that when they sang during COVID, everyone was singing the blessing song from all around the world. I have French evangelical friends who were in the French one. And the thing that surprised me most about the French song was how multicultural evangelicalism is in France. That's both through migration and through evangelism.
Hey, you mentioned Catholic churches. They had some statistics. There was some evidence of growth in Catholic churches. Now there's evidence of growth in evangelical churches. Let's get into some of the deep end here with you, Stephen, because the concept that people are experiencing something of the presence of God, which maybe they haven't had before in a church experience. How do you reflect on that?
Yeah, look, I think all of our ammunition was how can we philosophically realign somewhere like France with gospel frameworks? And what ended up happening was people who were lacking meaning and purpose had a real encounter with Jesus. And as you watch that video that I've got on my blog post, you meet young people in particular who have gone through crisis in life and they've called out, God, if you are there, help me, reveal yourself to me. And then they have a dream or a vision or someone gives them a Bible. And suddenly the meaning and purpose thing clicks. And they look at France and its way of life with less rose-coloured glasses. And they go, this country's great, it's got all these things, but it wasn't able to give me what I needed deep down, meaning and purpose and identity. And it was really interesting watching young people in particular say, the France of old isn't our France, and we need something more. And I think that's critical. Now, my friend who is evangelical in France, he's a typical Frenchman in many ways. He goes, there's 60 of us in church. There's only ever been 60. We don't need to be the majority. And he was one Christian among 4,000 students at his high school. But his family's Christian and they stay Christian. But he wrote to me after that blog post and said, yep, there's a sign of something moving. It's small, but it is moving, which is interesting.
Hey, when you mentioned meaning and purpose, I can't get away from the thought that definition is important. I mean, you can't have meaning and purpose unless you have something that defines who you are and what truth is. This is something that evangelicals are very strong on. What about evangelicalism now that there's this sort of momentum, this boost, people discovering something of a encounter with God, the actual meaning, the actual purpose around some form of definition? Does evangelicalism have that definition, do you think, to take things to a level of maturity with this new fresh growth?
Well, that'll be interesting to see whether it ends up being sort of a quiet, pietistic quietism in the corner, or whether it's going to be able to show a cynical French public that there is something worth living for. And I guess because of who Jesus is and because of the resurrection, that's the meaning and purpose behind Christianity. Make no mistake about it. Any version of Christianity which doesn't have a resurrected Jesus doesn't really last. It kind of fades out. But I think one of the other issues for me is that the French experiment of secularism is coming up against the bracing winds of the global world and Islam in particular has caused a lot of issues in France. There have been riots about the economy in France. There's seismic change. And Albert Camus, who was the great existentialist, wrote a book, The Stranger, or L'Étranger. And in it, you get this life in which someone just doesn't even know why they're doing what they're doing. And that was the French experience, I think. It's sort of morphed into nihilism. So you've got this nihilism on one side in which pleasure, and there's plenty of pleasure in France to be had, and meaning and purpose sit side by side. Now, you can get meaning and purpose from pleasure, but it runs out.
All right, the meaningfulness then of putting some boundaries and saying, let's define what's true and what is aligned with an eternal purpose rather than what's just a nihilistic pleasure in all of this. What do you think it is that's so attractive then to this momentum, evangelicalism? And let's include the Catholic Church in all of this too. If there's been growth there too, let's not just talk only about evangelicalism. These bounds, are they actually a freeing from some of those things that lead to a nihilism?
Yes, and what the video showed was that a sense of purpose in a community is important. So a community of people who believe is important. A vision of something transcendent. And this is where Roman Catholicism has done well, because it offers a very transcendent experience that is rooted clearly in history. And evangelicalism does that as well with the Bible very clearly. And it's saying these things didn't just come up recently. These are ancient documents that have stood the test of time, and they're ancient buildings that have witnessed to something bigger than ourselves. And when people have got the latest iPhone and everything is about the immediate, somehow things that are older than themselves start to kick back in as something worth exploring. And it's perhaps worth saying that many French people have no experience of Christianity whatsoever. So when they do find the gospel, they're like, how come no one ever told me about this? It's not as if they went to Sunday school and a Christian school, etc., etc. They had none of that, so it's new to them.
Hey, sometimes people align evangelicalism, let's put an ism on the end of there, and talk about that as being some sort of a political motive for people. There might be political motives in everything, but sometimes people have said, oh, evangelical, doesn't that have a political foundation to it? With the fear that somehow or other growing evangelicalism might actually become a political force that some people might think needs to be downtrodden. What are your thoughts around evangelicals often being associated with politics? Because this sort of thing comes up when you start to talk about growth in a nation like France. Thoughts from you, Stephen?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the video that I put up there labels what evangelicalism is about: conversion, the authority of the Bible, the infilling the Holy Spirit, and the requirement for new birth. So, but it doesn't say Trump, which is interesting, right? So it didn't align it politically. And if you look at evangelicals in France, there's absolutely no way they're going to get power. It's just not going to happen in that way in France. And I think the term evangelicalism across Europe is a little bit tainted. At the same time that evangelical churches historically in France and in Europe have been viewed as cults. They're not viewed as mainstream. So you go to Greek Orthodox in Greece would view evangelical churches as slightly dangerous, not because they're trying to get power, but because they're more like a cult. And I think the same would be true in France. So it will take a generation or two for, I think, French secular people to sit alongside evangelicals a little bit more comfortably without reading politics and power into it. But I think that's a long way from happening in France.
Not trying to take us off on some sort of unnecessary diversion here, but sometimes when we make that comparison, if you're talking Catholic or Orthodox, you've got this hierarchical structure, whereas evangelicalism has a much more flat, there's a lot more sort of everybody's equal and things are fair in this. There's going to be advantages on either side, and there might be some protections in the top-down structure, but there's also protections when everyone's got access to the Bible and they're all finding their way. How do you describe the way that things work like that? Because, you know, when we think of evangelicals being considered a cult in some nations in Europe, we want to know how do we actually make that orthodox orthodox? How do you say, no, this is legitimate? Thoughts on that, Steve?
Well, the greatest French theologian was John Calvin, and he was certainly not saying just do what you want. There was a line of authority, and it was Scripture. So the question is always, where does authority lie? And evangelicalism in France will work well when it understands it sits under Scripture, and that there is actually hierarchy at some level that is a hierarchy in the Bible. It's not a hierarchy that you just take. So France itself, for all its liberté, égalité, fraternité, it doesn't have a king, but it's got a ruling class that's been there since Napoleon. And it's very much a strong divide. And I think that French evangelicals can show a way of doing community that flattens the social hierarchies that have riven France apart.
Yes, and I love your thoughts there on transcendence, because when you were reflecting on the Catholics having a way of reflecting on transcendence, there's something very special in the way that Protestants reflect too on transcendence and the fact that God is above all, and there is a rule of law, and it's God's rule above all. Hey, I can't let you go, though, without talking about young people in the mix here, because is this all old people filling churches for the first time in France, or is there a movement from young people, say a Gen Z? What are your thoughts here?
Well, just in a cursory glance, I think it is younger people. I think the French older people still have a very strong affiliation with France being the model of secularism that can work in the world. But younger people are coming into the country from all around the world, and they're bringing their influences with it. But French people at universities are starting to ask questions in the same way that English people at universities are starting to ask questions. I think any university setting around the Western world is pretty much the same. Young people are looking for a good time, not looking for too many rules and regulations, but at the same time they're struggling with what's it all about? Where's this world going? So whether you're a Francophone or an Anglophone, I think the same questions come up among young people. Where is this all going? And I think that's going to be critical.
If we're connecting Australia into what's been happening, quiet revivals around the world, the UK, America, now we're talking about France, talking about Australia too, one of the things you identify in an article that you've written here is the concept of a meaning and purpose deficit. Is there something in that might even give us some hint or some insight into what, the conditions of revival might really respond so beautifully in? A meaning and purpose deficit, Stephen.
Yeah, another way of putting that is C.S. Lewis saying, God whispers in our pleasures and shouts in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And that's not just individual pain, that's societal and cultural pain. What are we here for? We've been told we've got all this stuff, but something like the pandemic showed up that, if you take away our white goods and our trips to Bali, we're a bit insecure about what we're supposed to be about. And I think those painful moments that are both personal and cultural, and when they combine, they say, well, what is this about? And I think that's God's way of stripping away some of the things that would keep us away from him, because we do know that having pleasure is great, and pleasure will blind you and deafen you to God's call in your life. And when he strips those things away, his voice comes through with a bit more clarity. I think that's happening culturally in the West.
Wonderful insights as always, Stephen McAlpine. And you mentioned the article. People can get a link there on your website. Let me point listeners, stephenmcalpine.com, and read the article, and I've had a look at the video. I think the video is compelling. It is fabulous, and you'll find that as part of that article that you'll be able to access on the website there, stephenmcalpine.com. The article's called Le Quiet Revival. I love your bit of French there. I noted, Stephen, you studied French a long time at school. It's like language anywhere, isn't it? If you don't use it, you lose it. You can lose some things, but, you've got some good French language in your article too. So I think some listeners will be wanting to have a look at that. StephenMcAlpine.com. Have a look for Le Quiet Revival. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us again today on 2020.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.